"If you don't trust me, leave," she said, and I realized that healthy relationships shouldn't require ultimatums about basic transparency. I should have trusted my instincts right then, but instead I spent the next few weeks apologizing for having legitimate concerns about my girlfriend's increasingly secretive behavior. I'm Troy, 29, and I work as a renewable energy consultant in Minneapolis, specializing in solar panel installations for residential and commercial properties. My job requires careful attention to detail and systematic problem-solving, skills that unfortunately made me acutely aware when something was fundamentally wrong in my personal life. I'd been dating Amber for 18 months, and until recently, things had felt solid between us. She worked at a marketing agency downtown, creating campaigns for local businesses, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine of shared dinners at home, weekend hikes around the Twin Cities lakes, and planning small trips to places like Duluth or Wisconsin Dells. We'd even started talking about moving to a bigger apartment together and maybe adopting a dog from one of the local shelters. But something shifted dramatically when her agency hired 3 new account coordinators in early spring, and suddenly Amber's entire social circle seemed to revolve around coworkers I'd never met, never heard about during her usual work stories, and apparently never would meet if she had anything to say about it. It started innocuously enough with weekend spa retreats and team-building exercises that required overnight stays at luxury resorts an hour outside the city, events that seemed unusually extravagant for a mid-sized marketing firm but weren't necessarily suspicious on their own. When I'd ask casual questions about her weekend plans, the kind of normal curiosity that couples share about each other's lives, or mention that I'd love to meet the colleagues she was spending so much time with, Amber's responses became increasingly defensive and accusatory in ways that caught me completely off guard. I'd been in enough relationships to know the difference between normal privacy and deliberate secrecy, the distinction between healthy independence and suspicious evasiveness, but every time I tried to address my growing concerns with the kind of honest communication I thought we'd established, Amber would flip the script and make me the problem. She'd accuse me of being controlling, possessive, and insecure, delivering these accusations with the kind of righteous indignation that made me question my own perception of reality and wonder if I was somehow becoming the type of boyfriend I'd never wanted to be. The pattern escalated over several weeks, with Amber becoming increasingly protective of her phone, changing her passcode from our shared anniversary date to something I didn't recognize, and developing a habit of taking calls in the bathroom or out on our apartment balcony where I couldn't overhear even general conversation topics. She'd started working late more frequently, claiming urgent deadlines that required her to stay at the office until 9 or 10 at night, though when I'd suggest bringing her dinner or picking her up afterward, she'd insist that wasn't necessary and would arrive home with takeout containers from restaurants she'd never mentioned before. The final straw came on a Thursday evening when I'd cooked dinner for us, something I enjoyed doing after long days spent crawling around dusty attics installing solar arrays, and I noticed her phone buzzing constantly throughout our meal. She kept angling the screen away from me while typing responses with unusual urgency, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of intensity usually reserved for work emergencies or family crises. When I gently asked if everything was okay at work, expecting a normal conversation about deadlines or difficult clients, Amber exploded with a level of anger that seemed completely disproportionate to my question and unlike anything I'd seen from her before. She accused me of monitoring her communications, questioned whether I'd ever truly respected her independence, and demanded to know why I couldn't trust her to manage her own professional relationships without my constant oversight and interrogation. I tried explaining that trust wasn't the issue, that I simply wanted to feel included in her life rather than constantly wondering why she seemed to be building walls between us and excluding me from increasingly large portions of her daily experience, but she cut me off with that ultimatum that would change everything between us. If I didn't trust her completely and without question, she said, then I should leave rather than make both of us miserable with my insecurity and jealousy, because she wasn't going to spend our relationship defending herself against my paranoid suspicions. The way she delivered those words, with such finality and conviction, made me realize that she wasn't interested in addressing my concerns or finding a middle ground where we could both feel secure and respected in our partnership. She wanted absolute freedom from accountability, and she was willing to end our relationship rather than provide the basic transparency that healthy partnerships require. That night, lying in our shared bed while she scrolled through her phone with the brightness turned down low, occasionally smiling at messages she clearly had no intention of sharing with me, I finally understood that I wasn't being controlling or unreasonable. I was simply expecting the kind of open communication that should exist between two people planning a future together, and Amber's violent reaction to that expectation told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities actually lay and whether I was really a partner in this relationship or just a convenient placeholder. I spent the next few weeks trying harder to ignore my instincts, suppressing my legitimate concerns about her mysterious late-night texts, canceled date nights for last-minute work events, and defensive reactions to simple questions about her day, but during one particularly quiet evening in our Minneapolis apartment, watching her guard her phone like it contained state secrets while we sat on opposite ends of the couch in uncomfortable silence, I realized that healthy relationships shouldn't require me to suppress my instincts or apologize for wanting basic transparency and trust. While Amber departed for her 4-day girls' trip to Miami with colleagues I'd never met, I spent the first day doing something I'd never imagined myself doing in a relationship, researching apartments and calculating my finances with the methodical precision I usually reserved for solar installation projects. I had taken Thursday and Friday off work, ostensibly to catch up on household projects and maybe surprise Amber with a deep-cleaned apartment when she returned, but instead I found myself sitting at our kitchen table with my laptop, browsing rental listings and running numbers on what it would cost to start over completely. The math was surprisingly encouraging since I'd always been careful with money, and I realized that I'd been subsidizing more of our shared expenses than I'd consciously acknowledged, from groceries to streaming services to the premium gym membership she insisted we needed for the yoga classes she attended twice before losing interest. By day 2, while Amber was presumably enjoying poolside mimosas and spa treatments in Miami, I'd secured a month-to-month lease on a furnished studio apartment across town in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, a clean space with good natural light and parking included in the rent. I opened a separate bank account at a different branch of my credit union, something I could manage entirely online without involving our shared financial institution, and arranged for professional movers to come Saturday morning while Amber would still be traveling back from Florida. The systematic approach felt oddly calming, like solving a complex engineering problem where each piece needed to fit precisely into place for the whole system to function properly. I spent Friday methodically packing my belongings, separating my possessions from our shared items with the kind of careful inventory I might use when documenting solar equipment for insurance purposes. My clothes, books, kitchen gadgets I'd brought to the relationship, the camping gear from my college years, and the few pieces of furniture that were definitively mine, including the desk where I'd been sitting when I decided our relationship was over. I transferred the utilities into Amber's name alone, calling each company to explain that I was moving out and would no longer be responsible for the bills, a conversation that felt surprisingly liberating after months of managing expenses she treated as automatically my responsibility. I canceled our shared streaming services and removed my name from our joint gym membership, small administrative tasks that felt like reclaiming pieces of my independence I hadn't realized I'd gradually surrendered. Saturday morning, the movers arrived precisely on time, 3 efficient guys who had my entire life loaded into their truck within 2 hours, leaving behind only the furniture Amber had chosen and the kitchen supplies she preferred. I left a concise note on the kitchen island where she always dropped her keys, written on plain white paper in my normal handwriting without dramatics or lengthy explanations. I chose trust. The note read, in myself, and then underneath, the lease and utilities are yours now, followed by my signature and the date. I didn't apologize, didn't explain my decision-making process, and didn't leave contact information for further discussion, because I'd realized that someone who delivered ultimatums about trust wasn't interested in genuine conversation about relationship problems. Before leaving our shared apartment for the final time, I walked through each room methodically, checking for anything I might have forgotten and mentally cataloging the memories associated with spaces that had felt like home until they didn't anymore. I collected my spare key from the hook by the front door, along with the garage door opener and mailbox key, leaving them next to my note as a clear signal that I was returning everything that belonged to this chapter of my life. I blocked Amber's phone number while sitting in my car outside the building, a decision I made without hesitation because I knew she'd want to argue, negotiate, or somehow convince me to return to a dynamic that had become emotionally exhausting and fundamentally unequal. I drove to my new studio apartment with a strange sense of relief, like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale properly, and spent my first evening of freedom eating Thai takeout while setting up my desk by the window and planning how to arrange my newly simplified life. The silence in my own space felt different from the tense quiet that had characterized our shared evenings, comfortable rather than loaded with unspoken accusations and carefully avoided topics. I fell asleep that night on my own schedule, without watching Amber scroll through her phone or listening to her late-night text conversations with people she'd never bothered to introduce me to, and I woke up Sunday morning with the satisfying knowledge that I'd chosen action over endless anxiety about a situation that was never going to improve on its own. Amber returned from Miami to discover empty closets, missing furniture, and my note, immediately launching into what I could only describe as a comprehensive social media campaign designed to portray herself as the victim of an unexplained abandonment by a partner who'd apparently suffered some kind of mental breakdown. I learned about her reaction through mutual friends who started reaching out within hours of her return, initially confused and concerned about why I'd apparently disappeared without warning from what they'd assumed was a stable relationship based on the image Amber had been carefully cultivating online. The irony wasn't lost on me that Amber had spent months building walls between us, systematically excluding me from her social circle and daily activities, but when I finally respected her boundaries completely by removing myself from the situation, she suddenly wanted everyone to know how devastated she was by my unexpected departure. Through carefully orchestrated posts across multiple platforms, she painted herself as someone who'd been blindsided by a partner's sudden personality change, never mentioning the ultimatum she delivered about trust or the months of secretive behavior that had led to my decision to take her advice literally. Our mutual friend Marcus called me Tuesday afternoon, genuinely worried about my well-being and confused about what had happened between Amber and me over the weekend. Since the last time he'd seen us together, everything had seemed normal on the surface. When I calmly explained that I'd simply taken Amber's advice about leaving if I didn't trust her, Marcus grew quiet for a long moment before admitting that he'd been getting a very different version of events from Amber's social media posts and the emotional conversations she'd been having with his girlfriend Lisa about my allegedly erratic behavior. The story Amber was telling their social circle involved me having some kind of emotional breakdown, becoming irrationally jealous and possessive over innocent work friendships, and eventually abandoning her without explanation after she tried everything possible to save our relationship through patience and understanding. It was fascinating to watch someone rewrite history in real time, transforming herself from the person who'd delivered ultimatums and defensive accusations into someone who'd been victimized by those same ultimatums being taken seriously by someone who'd reached their breaking point. But the most interesting development came Thursday evening when Marcus sent me a screenshot that Amber had apparently forgotten to make private on her Instagram story, a mistake that would completely undermine the narrative she'd been building all week. The image showed her and Derek, one of the new account coordinators from her marketing agency, sharing what was clearly a romantic dinner at an upscale Miami restaurant, complete with champagne glasses, intimate lighting, and body language that definitely didn't suggest a professional relationship between colleagues attending a work retreat. In the background of the photo, I could see what appeared to be the same luxury resort where Amber had claimed to be attending a girls-only spa retreat with her coworkers, and Derek's hand was visible resting possessively on her shoulder in a way that suggested this wasn't their first romantic evening together or even their first romantic getaway. When I sent Marcus a casual response acknowledging that I'd seen the photo and wasn't particularly surprised by its contents, given the pattern of behavior I'd been observing for months, he immediately called me back to discuss what this revelation meant about the timeline of Amber's behavior and the real reason behind her increasingly defensive reactions to my questions about transparency and communication. The math was pretty straightforward once you had the missing piece of information that explained everything else. And Marcus admitted that he felt foolish for not recognizing the obvious signs of someone who'd been planning an exit strategy while simultaneously making their current partner feel guilty for noticing something was fundamentally wrong with their relationship dynamic. By Friday, word had apparently gotten back to Amber that I'd seen the Instagram evidence of her Miami romance, because her social media narrative shifted dramatically from heartbroken victim to righteous anger about my alleged violations of her privacy and trust, as if my awareness of her public posts somehow constituted stalking behavior. She began posting about toxic masculinity, controlling behavior, and the importance of women maintaining their independence in relationships, as if my discovery of her public social media posts somehow represented surveillance or monitoring rather than basic awareness of information she'd chosen to share with hundreds of followers. The pivot was so obvious and desperate that several of our mutual friends started questioning the story she'd been telling them about my supposedly irrational behavior, and I began receiving messages from people who wanted to hear my side of what had actually happened between us over the past few months. When Amber realized that the photographic evidence contradicted her victim narrative and that people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about the timeline of her relationship with Derek, she shifted tactics completely, enlisting our mutual friend circle to pressure me into talking things through like adults and giving her an opportunity to explain the context behind the Miami photos. This seemed like an interesting definition of adult behavior from someone who'd been conducting a secret relationship while living with someone else, but I maintained my boundaries by politely declining these intervention attempts and asking friends not to serve as intermediaries in a situation that was fundamentally between Amber and me. I noticed that she seemed particularly frustrated by my refusal to engage in the kind of dramatic confrontation that would have given her more material for her ongoing social media campaign about toxic relationships, emotional abandonment, and the challenges of dating men who couldn't handle strong, independent women pursuing their career goals and professional relationships. Unable to reach me directly since I'd blocked her number, Amber began showing up at my workplace with increasing frequency, claiming she needed to return my belongings, though I noticed she was always empty-handed when she appeared at the reception desk of our renewable energy consulting firm downtown. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday morning when she arrived during my busiest period, telling our receptionist Sarah that she had urgent personal business to discuss with me and refusing to leave when informed that I was in meetings with clients all day reviewing solar installation proposals. Our office manager eventually had to ask building security to escort her from the premises after she'd spent nearly an hour in the lobby making increasingly dramatic statements about being denied access to someone she'd been in a relationship with for over a year. I spent the rest of that day fielding concerned questions from colleagues who'd witnessed what appeared to be a domestic dispute in our professional environment, exactly the kind of workplace disruption that could affect my reputation in an industry where client trust and professional stability were essential for career advancement. Amber's strategy seemed deliberately designed to create maximum embarrassment and disruption, timing her visits for moments when the office was busiest and most likely to have witnesses to whatever scene she planned to create if given the opportunity to confront me directly about my supposed cruel abandonment. The second incident came later that week when she managed to slip past reception during lunch hour and actually made it to my desk area, where she launched into a loud performance about my cruel abandonment and refusal to communicate like a mature adult about our relationship problems and the future we'd been building together. My supervisor Jake overheard enough of the confrontation to later pull me aside and ask if I needed any assistance dealing with what he diplomatically described as personal complications that might affect my work environment or ability to focus on client relationships. I explained the basic situation without going into excessive detail, emphasizing that I'd ended the relationship cleanly and wasn't encouraging or participating in these workplace ambushes that seemed designed to force some kind of dramatic reunion or ongoing emotional engagement. Meanwhile, Amber had apparently decided that if she couldn't reach me directly through workplace harassment, she would work through my family members to apply pressure for reconciliation or at least some form of continued contact that would give her ongoing access to my emotional energy and decision-making process. She began following my younger sister Maya on social media platforms, commenting supportively on her posts about photography projects and local music venues, and gradually building what appeared to be a genuine friendship based on shared interests that had nothing to do with me or our former relationship. Over several weeks, Amber fed Maya carefully crafted stories about my sudden personality change, describing someone who'd become cold, distant, and emotionally unavailable after years of being loving, supportive, and committed to building a future together with someone who'd thought they'd found their life partner. She told Maya that she was genuinely worried about my mental health and suggested that our parents' messy divorce years earlier had triggered some kind of delayed emotional breakdown that was causing me to push away everyone who cared about me, including romantic partners who'd invested significant time and energy into supporting me through difficult periods. The manipulation was subtle but extremely effective, and Maya eventually called me with genuine concern about whether I was dealing with depression, anxiety, or some other psychological crisis that would explain my apparently heartless treatment of someone who clearly loved me and was devastated by my unexpected departure from her life. When I calmly explained the real timeline of events leading up to our breakup, including Amber's pattern of secretive behavior, defensive reactions to reasonable questions, and the ultimatum that had ultimately ended our relationship, Maya was shocked to realize how completely she'd been manipulated by someone who'd positioned herself as a concerned ex-girlfriend rather than someone pursuing a calculated campaign to regain access to my life through family pressure. The workplace harassment escalated significantly when I started dating Jessica, a veterinary technician I'd met at a coffee shop near my new apartment, someone who represented everything Amber wasn't in terms of emotional stability, professional focus, genuine kindness, and authentic interest in building something healthy together rather than extracting maximum drama and emotional intensity from every interaction. Amber somehow discovered this development, possibly through social media monitoring or through the network of mutual friends she'd been systematically cultivating as allies in her ongoing campaign to portray me as an emotionally unstable partner who'd abandoned a loving relationship without justification or proper communication about my concerns. Within days of my first public social media post featuring Jessica at a local farmer's market, Amber began creating fake profiles to leave negative reviews on the veterinary clinic where Jessica worked, disguising her harassment as concerned pet owners questioning the judgment, professionalism, and reliability of staff members who dated men with apparent commitment issues and documented histories of abandoning partners without warning or explanation. The reviews were carefully crafted to sound like legitimate customer complaints rather than obvious personal attacks, mentioning specific concerns about staff distraction during appointments, unprofessional behavior with clients, and serious questions about whether someone going through relationship drama could properly focus on animal care responsibilities that required complete attention and emotional stability. Jessica discovered these reviews during a staff meeting where her supervisor mentioned some unusual negative feedback that seemed unrelated to actual veterinary services or patient care, and when she showed me the posts on her phone, I immediately recognized Amber's distinctive writing style and specific details about relationship patterns that only someone with inside knowledge of our personal history could have known or referenced. I documented everything systematically while working with my company's HR department to establish formal protocols for handling unexpected visits from former partners, and I provided Jessica with complete transparency about Amber's escalating behavior patterns so she could make informed decisions about her own safety, professional reputation, and whether she wanted to continue developing our relationship despite the obvious complications. The fake review campaign represented a significant escalation that crossed the line from personal harassment into deliberate attempts to damage an innocent person's livelihood and professional standing in the veterinary community. And I realized that Amber's behavior was becoming increasingly unhinged and potentially dangerous as she lost control of the narrative she'd been trying to construct around our breakup and my supposed psychological instability. After Amber appeared at my apartment building at midnight claiming Derek had broken up with her and she needed closure with me to move forward with her life, building security immediately called police who issued a formal trespassing warning that should have ended her escalating harassment campaign once and for all. I was actually impressed by how quickly our building management took the situation seriously, since they'd apparently dealt with similar domestic issues before and recognized the signs of someone who might become increasingly desperate and unpredictable if not addressed through official channels and proper legal documentation. The police officer who responded was professional but thorough, documenting everything in a formal report and explaining to Amber in clear, unambiguous terms that any future attempts to contact me or enter the building would result in immediate arrest for criminal trespassing, since she had no legitimate business on the property and I'd clearly established through multiple channels that I wanted no further contact with her under any circumstances. But Amber violated the trespassing warning within just 3 days, apparently unable to accept that legal consequences might actually apply to her behavior or that her emotional needs didn't supersede established legal boundaries. by intercepting my mail delivery and using my forwarded address information to send packages containing items I definitely hadn't forgotten when I moved out of our shared apartment. The packages arrived over several days through different carriers and contained our old photos that I'd intentionally left behind because they represented a chapter of my life I was ready to close, love letters I'd written during happier times that she'd apparently saved for maximum emotional impact during this campaign, and a lengthy handwritten manifesto about cowards who run from real love instead of fighting for relationships that could be salvaged through honest communication, mutual commitment, and willingness to work through temporary difficulties. Reading her rambling 10-page letter felt like getting a disturbing glimpse into the mental state of someone who'd constructed an elaborate fantasy about our relationship that bore little resemblance to the reality I'd actually experienced, including specific claims that I'd promised marriage and children during conversations I distinctly remembered going very differently and decisions I'd never actually made or discussed seriously. When she started following Jessica's car after work from the veterinary clinic to her apartment complex and taking photos of my new apartment building from the parking lot across the street with what appeared to be a telephoto lens, behavior that Jessica's coworkers noticed and reported to her supervisor out of concern for her safety, I finally consulted with a family law attorney who specialized in harassment, stalking, and domestic violence cases. The attorney, Rebecca Martinez, had over 15 years of experience dealing with exactly this type of escalating behavior and reviewed all my documentation with the kind of systematic attention I appreciated, examining screenshots, printed emails, witness statements, building security reports, and the police report from the trespassing incident to build a comprehensive picture of Amber's increasingly dangerous behavior over several months. She explained that Amber's actions clearly met the legal definition of stalking under Minnesota state law, particularly the documented pattern of following, surveillance, and deliberate attempts to interfere with my employment and personal relationships through systematic harassment of third parties who had no involvement in our former relationship. The restraining order application process was more straightforward than I'd expected, requiring detailed documentation of specific incidents with dates, times, locations, and witness information, all of which I'd been carefully maintaining since the first workplace visit using the same organizational skills I applied to complex solar installation projects. Rebecca helped me organize everything into a chronological timeline that clearly demonstrated escalation from initial social media manipulation to workplace harassment to illegal surveillance and criminal trespassing, showing a pattern that posed genuine threats to my safety, professional reputation, and ability to maintain normal relationships without fear of retaliation or interference. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Rebecca warned me that Amber would likely try to portray herself as the victim of a vindictive ex-partner using the legal system to punish her for ending their relationship, a common defense strategy that relied on manipulating the court's sympathy rather than addressing the documented evidence of harassment and stalking behavior that violated multiple state laws. During the preparation process, Rebecca's background investigation discovered that this wasn't Amber's first experience with restraining orders, as her ex-boyfriend from college had filed similar paperwork 3 years earlier after she'd engaged in comparable harassment following their breakup, though those records were sealed and could only be referenced indirectly during our hearing as evidence of a pattern of behavior. The most disturbing revelation came when Rebecca's investigation revealed that Amber had been systematically fabricating stories to our former mutual friends about me stealing money from joint accounts that had never existed and threatening her during our relationship with violence that had never occurred, lies that could have seriously damaged my professional reputation if anyone had believed them and reported the allegations to my employer or professional licensing board. These fabricated accusations represented a level of malicious deception that went far beyond the emotional manipulation I'd already experienced, suggesting someone who was willing to make false criminal allegations to support her victim narrative and potentially destroy my career in the renewable energy industry where trust and professional integrity were essential for client relationships and business development opportunities that could take years to rebuild if damaged by false accusations. The restraining order was granted after I presented my documented evidence including time-stamped photos, preserved social media posts, building security footage, and witness statements from Jessica's coworkers, building security staff, and my own colleagues who'd witnessed the workplace harassment incidents firsthand. The judge reviewed everything methodically, asking specific questions about the timeline of events and the escalating nature of Amber's behavior over several months, and seemed particularly concerned about the false accusations she'd been spreading to mutual friends and the systematic campaign to damage Jessica's professional reputation through fake online reviews that could have affected her career in veterinary medicine. Amber's behavior during the court hearing was exactly what Rebecca had predicted, alternating between tearful victim performances where she claimed to be heartbroken and confused by my sudden abandonment, and angry outbursts about my supposed cruelty and emotional manipulation that revealed the calculating nature beneath her carefully constructed facade. But the documented evidence spoke louder than her dramatic testimony about being abandoned by someone she trusted and loved, and the judge seemed unimpressed by her attempts to reframe months of stalking behavior as the actions of a concerned ex-girlfriend trying to maintain contact with someone she cared about. The judge issued a comprehensive restraining order requiring Amber to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my workplace, my apartment building, and Jessica's veterinary clinic, with specific prohibitions against contacting me through any means including social media, email, phone calls, or third-party intermediaries who might serve as conduits for continued harassment. The order also included provisions preventing her from creating fake online accounts to monitor my social media activity or leave negative reviews about businesses where Jessica worked, and violations would result in immediate arrest and potential jail time for contempt of court. But Amber's problems were just beginning, because her behavior at her marketing firm had become increasingly erratic as she faced the reality of legal consequences and the collapse of her victim narrative when confronted with actual evidence of her harassment campaign rather than the emotional manipulation that had worked with our mutual friends. She'd apparently been using company time and resources to monitor my social media accounts, create fake review profiles, and coordinate her harassment activities during work hours. Behavior that came to light when her supervisor Derek reported her increasingly unstable conduct to their human resources department following several incidents where she'd become verbally aggressive with coworkers who refused to support her version of events. Derek himself had become a target of Amber's anger when he refused to provide ongoing emotional support for her campaign against me and began distancing himself from their romantic involvement, leading her to make explicit threats against his career and personal relationships that he felt obligated to report to their management team for his own protection and professional reputation within the marketing industry. The irony of Derek reporting Amber's threatening behavior wasn't lost on me, considering their romantic relationship in Miami had been the catalyst for my decision to leave our shared apartment and end our relationship entirely, though I felt a certain satisfaction knowing that he was experiencing firsthand the kind of manipulative behavior that I'd been dealing with for months before finally choosing to remove myself from the situation. 6 months after the restraining order was finalized, I learned through my sister Maya that Amber had been terminated from her marketing position following a formal investigation into her use of company resources for personal vendettas and had moved back to her hometown in Wisconsin after what Maya described as a brief psychiatric hold following an incident where she'd been found outside Derek's apartment building at 3 a.m. claiming he'd ruined her life and destroyed her relationship with me. The psychiatric evaluation apparently revealed that Amber had been struggling with significant mental health issues including borderline personality disorder and attachment disorders that had gone untreated for years, contributing to her inability to accept the natural consequences of her own choices and her established pattern of blaming others for relationship failures that consistently resulted from her own destructive and manipulative behavior patterns. Maya had stayed in contact with some of our former mutual friends who reported that Amber's family had finally intervened after learning about the restraining order, the job termination, and the circumstances that led to her psychiatric evaluation, insisting that she seek comprehensive professional help for what they recognized as a dangerous pattern of obsessive behavior that had affected multiple relationships and was clearly escalating toward potentially violent outcomes. I felt a mixture of relief and genuine sympathy for someone who was clearly dealing with serious psychological issues that went far beyond our failed relationship, though I maintained my boundaries absolutely and had no interest in being involved in her recovery process or offering forgiveness that might be misinterpreted as an invitation for renewed contact or emotional engagement. Jessica and I continued building our relationship on a foundation of open communication, mutual respect, and the kind of genuine transparency that I'd learned to value after experiencing what happened when trust and honesty were systematically undermined by someone committed to deception and manipulation. We developed stronger security habits, including checking our credit reports regularly, maintaining security cameras at both our residences, and staying alert to any signs that Amber might violate the restraining order, though as time passed those precautions felt less necessary and more like reasonable safeguards that any responsible adult might maintain in an increasingly complex world. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation tactics early in relationships, trusting my instincts when something felt fundamentally wrong despite gaslighting attempts, and the critical importance of documenting concerning behavior rather than hoping it would resolve itself through patience and understanding that wasn't reciprocated by someone determined to avoid accountability for their actions. 2 years later, I received a formal letter through Jessica's veterinary clinic, since it was the last known address in Amber's records where she might successfully reach me, containing a typed apology that appeared to have been written as part of a structured therapeutic process rather than another sophisticated manipulation attempt designed to re-establish contact. The letter acknowledged her manipulative behavior, systematic harassment campaign, and the false accusations she deliberately spread about me to mutual friends and acquaintances, though she requested no response and explicitly stated that she understood and respected my desire for no further contact between us under any circumstances. Reading her apology felt surreal after everything we'd been through together and separately, and I found myself analyzing each paragraph for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas before realizing that my hypervigilance was probably unnecessary given the substantial time that had passed and the comprehensive nature of her acknowledgement of wrongdoing and responsibility for her behavior. The letter explained that she'd been participating in intensive therapy for over 18 months, had been formally diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and attachment trauma stemming from childhood experiences I'd never known about during our relationship, and was working systematically to understand how her untreated mental health issues had contributed to the destruction of multiple relationships through consistent patterns of manipulation, control, and emotional sabotage. She thanked me for setting firm boundaries that had ultimately forced her to confront her issues rather than continuing to blame others for the consequences of her own destructive behavior, though the irony wasn't lost on me that she was essentially expressing gratitude for something she'd fought against so desperately and vindicatively when it was actually happening in real time. I shared the letter with Jessica, now my fiancée, after a proposal that had been planned with the same careful attention I brought to everything important in my life, as we discussed how my experience with Amber had taught both of us to value the open communication and mutual respect that formed the unshakable foundation of healthy relationships where both partners felt secure enough to be vulnerable without fear of manipulation, retaliation, or emotional punishment. Standing in our shared kitchen while meal prepping for the week, something we turned into an enjoyable Sunday routine that represented the kind of domestic partnership I'd always wanted but never experienced until I found someone who shared my values about cooperation and mutual contribution. I reflected on how choosing to trust myself had been the foundation for everything good that followed in my life. When Amber had delivered that ultimatum about trust, demanding that I either trust her completely without question or leave the relationship entirely, she'd inadvertently forced me to examine what trust actually meant in the context of a healthy partnership between two people planning a future together based on honesty and transparency. I'd learned that trust wasn't about suppressing legitimate concerns or ignoring obvious red flags to avoid conflict and maintain artificial peace, but about choosing partners who earned and maintained trust through consistent actions, transparent communication, and genuine respect for boundaries, accountability, and the emotional well-being of their partner. The experience had taught me that someone who viewed basic transparency as controlling behavior wasn't someone I could build a stable life with, and that healthy relationships required both partners to be willing to address concerns openly rather than demanding blind faith without providing legitimate reasons for that faith to exist and flourish. Jessica understood this completely, having witnessed firsthand how Amber's manipulation tactics had affected not just me but everyone in her orbit who'd been drawn into her campaign of lies and emotional manipulation, and our relationship thrived on the foundation of genuine partnership rather than one person demanding that the other accept whatever they chose to share or deliberately withhold. We'd built something beautiful based on mutual choice rather than ultimatums, where trust was earned daily through small actions and consistent behavior rather than demanded through emotional manipulation and threats of abandonment designed to control rather than nurture. Looking back with the clarity that time and emotional distance provided, I realized that Amber's ultimatum had actually been a gift, though certainly not the kind she'd intended to give when she delivered it with such conviction and finality. It had forced me to choose between accepting unacceptable behavior that violated my basic values about honesty and trusting my own judgment about what I deserved in a relationship with someone who claimed to love me. Choosing to trust myself, my instincts about transparency and communication, and my fundamental right to expect basic honesty from someone I was planning a future with, had led me to remove myself from a toxic situation and eventually find someone who shared my values about what partnership actually meant in practice rather than just in theory. The night I'd moved out of our shared apartment with nothing more than a simple note explaining that I'd chosen trust in myself, I'd felt uncertain about whether I was making the right decision or throwing away something that could have been salvaged through more patience and understanding on my part. 2 years later, engaged to someone who viewed open communication as a strength rather than a threat, living in a home where both partners contributed equally to building something positive together, I knew with absolute certainty that trusting myself had been the most important decision I'd ever made in my personal life. Amber's letter had been a final reminder that choosing healthy boundaries wasn't cruelty, even when it forced someone to confront uncomfortable truths about their own behavior and the impact of their choices on others, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive patterns by removing yourself as a target for their manipulation and control. I never responded to her letter, maintaining the boundaries that had served both of us well in our separate journeys toward better mental health and more honest relationships, but I kept it as a tangible reminder of how far we'd both traveled from that night when she demanded I choose between trust and leaving, never imagining that I'd choose the option that would ultimately benefit us both in ways she couldn't have predicted.